Okay, everyone, let's start. I'm going to introduce Adam because some of you may not know Adam, but I do want to give him a brief introduction. For those of you who don't know Adam, Adam's been along the RLAI path for, I think, since 2012. So some of you who are new may not know that, but Adam was in the RLAI lab a very long time ago, one of our longest running members as an undergraduate, and now he's joined with me as a PhD student, and he's actually in rehabilitation sciences, but I think that it may be slightly different. There will be less mathematical derivations than I think we may have seen in some of the other talks, but I think it's equally relevant to everyone here in terms of the interactions that humans have with learning machines. It's all about learning machines. So anyway, Adam is a longtime RLAI member, and please welcome for today's Tea Time Talk. Take it away, Adam.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out and hearing me ramble not about math or equations at all. As Patrick mentioned, I'm in rehabilitation science doing a PhD. I'm here because my interests are in assistive robotics, machine learning, and communication. And when I say communication, I mean a little bit less bits down wires and Shannon's theory and all those really cool things, though that does play into it, but I won't today. And more about viewing communication as a means of interaction between agents. And this is of ever-increasing importance as in our society at large, not only are we interacting more and more with machines and computational devices that aren't necessarily machines, but we're more and more giving them machine intelligence, machine learning, however you want to phrase it, so that they can learn and adapt. This means, consequently, there's an increase in the need to think about how humans and machine learning is going to be interacting. It's common in a lot of work with robotics and computer science, machine learning, to think about control interactions. The human wants to do something, the system learns to do it. The system just wants to do something and learns how to perform a task more effectively. And it's easy to not think about the human side of these things. My undergraduate work was in electrical engineering. We tended not to think about humans except as unwanted paths to ground. And that's one of the reasons I chose to do my PhD work in rehabilitation medicine. Rehabilitation medicine is very focused on the person. The patient and their family specifically are at the core of work in rehabilitation. There's a lot of human-human interactions. Occupational and physical therapists, clinicians, all interacting with the patient to try and overcome an injury or otherwise improve their lives. There's a lot of human-machine interactions that are beginning to come into it. And there's a lot of interest in rehabilitation in human-machine interactions. Some of it to do telepresence rehabilitation over Skype potentially. There's every class I took that mentioned technology brought up Microsoft's HoloLens VR video as something that could be potentially super amazing for getting care to remote regions where there aren't necessarily physical therapists or the same level of expertise as we have in city centers like Edmonton. And coming from rehabilitation, there's this person-first language. A paper I recently submitted to ICOR came back to me with one of the editor's suggestions to change some of the language I used from amputees and non-amputee subjects to people with amputations and people without amputations. And this is across rehabilitation. Instead of saying autistic people, it's preferred to comment about people with autism. And this thought pattern winds its way into the treatment section as well, where it's patient-centered care. It starts to matter more what the patient wants and what the patient's family wants than what we, the expert, feel is best for them. And when I was just starting in Patrick's lab, I overheard an anecdote from our close collaborator clinician, Dr. Jacqueline Hébert, who was talking about a gentleman who got referred to them from his clinic up north. This person was missing a hand and had a prosthetic that they devised on their own, and the clinician up there thought that we could rig them up with something better down here. This gentleman walked into the clinic with his missing hand replaced with the tip of a harpoon strapped to his arm with leather straps. And so the clinician said, yeah, we can definitely get him a proper body-powered prosthetic, which I will show you on the next slide. And as they did so, they did a bit of training, they sent him on his way back home. Very quickly, they learned he wasn't using the body-powered prosthetic. He was using the harpoon tip. The harpoon was the tool that he needed in his life. It was what allowed him to do what he wanted to do. And that's an important concept that is growing and growing in rehabilitation. I think bears considering across disciplines. And so I've been talking about prosthetic limbs. In case you're not aware, a prosthetic limb is an artificial limb, some sort of mechanical or robotic device. The image at the top is what we would call a physical system. It's driven by cables and pulleys, typically straps across the back to the other arm, and they can shrug and do things with their shoulders to help articulate it. The one on the bottom is a very advanced myoelectric prosthetic, which is, for all intents and purposes, a robot. Has a lot of potential functionality in it, and a lot of potential capacity. What happens typically is people who have an amputation will choose the top arm over the bottom arm for various reasons, including, but hopefully diminishing, control, a lack of feedback. They don't really have the same awareness of the limb or what it's doing. They don't understand it as well as the physical system, where they get resistance from the cables sliding, and when they get different resistance at different angles. So they get more of a sense of it than they do with these myoelectric limbs. And prosthetic limbs are interesting not only because it happens to be what we look at in the Blink lab, but because they are intended to be a very close coupling of human and machine. The prosthetic limb is intended to live with the person and be a part of their body for the rest of their lives. And machine learning has been getting looked at this for some time. There's a couple of different ways we look at machine learning in artificial limbs. One of the earliest was prediction. And Patrick's, I think, first master's student, and Edward's, did some work on dynamic and adaptive switching, so that instead of having a fixed list of things to switch through, the system would learn to reorder that list to always give you the next one that you wanted. Some cool work has been done involving representation. Jaden Travnik looked at Canerva coding with a mind to help with computational efficiency and help create a prosthesis eye view of the situation in the world, and did some cool work on representation that is applicable across machine learning out of just rehab and just prosthetics into a lot of useful things. And a lot of work is being done with control. A few months back, we had a visitor from Germany, from German Aerospace, Claudio Castellini, who spoke about cool stuff he was doing with pattern recognition, learning to interpret signals coming from the muscles in order to translate that into various hand grip patterns. And they got up to about a 95% precision in their accuracy, which is pretty good. And so all of this kind of comes together to build a picture that isn't necessarily clear unless the rehabilitation part starts to settle. And prosthetics in particular, being attached to a human, and with that person-first viewpoint, most, if not all, prosthetic limbs on patients are robots that can't move themselves. They don't have any ability to move their servos, to move in one direction or another at all. The human is in complete control of what the robot is doing. But we're talking about putting machine learning into these systems, so we're potentially giving them goals, things that they want to do. And we need to think about ways that they can accomplish these tasks while the human remains in absolute control at all times. There's a human attached to them, and this is something that we can leverage. And a thought experiment that I like to use as a demonstration begins with the Create. I'm not sure if you guys still really use the Creates in the RLAI lab. When I started, they were a primary platform in Rich's microworlds that we used to study very basic sensory motor stream information because they're a nice, simple robot. There are wheels underneath and it can move. There are a couple of different sensors on it. Specifically for this, we care about the bump sensors that you can see on that kind of buffer on the front. It can tell a left and a right bump from each other. And so let's say you're a learning agent in the Create. What you want to do, your goal, is to drive forward. This is how you accumulate reward. You're aware of the left and the right bump sensor independently, And you know that how to turn left and how to turn right. And that's what you've got. So, because you want to drive forward, you start out by driving forward. You're trundling through the world, which is possibly a nice little contained pen, and a bump sensor goes off. Rats. Now I can't go forward. So what do? I try and turn until I can go forward again, till the bump sensor turns off. And over time, you begin to associate. So if my left bump sensor's gone off, I need to turn right to start going forward faster. If my right one's gone off, I need to turn left. If you're in a particularly advanced intelligence in there, maybe you can make a prediction about the bump sensor. You can turn before it ever even goes off and absolutely optimize your going forward time and be a happy little create singing about the pen. Now, let's consider that same situation with one small twist. So you still want to go forward. That's still how you get reward. You still have the bump sensors, but now you can't take actions. Now there's a human in a different room who's sitting at a computer and has arrow keys. And the human has to push the forward, left, or right arrow key in order to make an action happen to you. You do have some line of communication going to this human. So you have some lights or some sounds that you can play in order to try and see what happens. You as the robot aren't necessarily aware there's a human. You just know you can't move your wheels, but you have these other things. So you're sitting there, you're not moving yet. So you try a light, something happens. Try a different light, something else happens. You try a sound, you start going forward. Oh great, so now I can move forward when I play this sound. That happens till you hit a wall. Now you can't go forward anymore. Rats. You try a light, maybe you turn. All right, this is working. Eventually you start to associate actions down what an external observer sees as the communication path with outcomes in your sensory motor perception. When my right bump sensor is off, if I turn on this light, my right bump sensor is on, pardon me. I can turn on this light, the bump sensor turns off, I can play this sound and I'll go forward. As surely and causally as if you're doing it yourself to make it happen. That's not quite what's happening. Having to pass your actions through a human adds all sorts of scary words like stochasticity and non-stationarity and partial observability, but it's pretty close. And thinking of communicating as an action isn't a super new development in and of itself. A while back, Dr. Angeliki Lizardo, which I'm probably terribly pronouncing and I apologize if she ever sees this, talked about emergent communication. She had two machine learning agents that had to interact to accomplish their goal, but no defined way of doing so. They just had an arbitrary vocabulary, they had to try and figure out what each other meant, and they did. They succeeded at learning to use the symbols they'd been given to communicate to accomplish their task. This is machine-machine interactions, which is very cool. There's a much larger body of literature on joint action, which looks at human-human interactions in a collaborative environment. And I strongly encourage everyone here who hasn't to read at least one joint action paper. I find it absolutely staggering how similar a lot of the language they use and the way they talk about problems is to papers that I've read on reinforcement learning. And if you need a suggestion, absolutely hit me up on Slack and I can send you some. It's really cool. And one of the main things that comes out of a lot of the joint action research is the importance of a model of the other agent, or being able to predict the other agent. And very interestingly, there's an importance in nonverbal communication. This paper I'm going to outline specifically because it's probably one of my favorite papers I've read in the last few years. They had people come in and do their typical neuroscience tasks where they touch things on a screen to make something happen. And they brought them in, they scored them all individually. They used something called the Miller-Race equation, which I'm still trying to fully understand exactly how this works. But they used that to predict what they would score on the task if they worked together. They found that strangers about met up with the expectations of the Miller-Race equation. People who were familiar beforehand, people who were friends or in a relationship, would score much higher when they worked together on a task. And then it gets interesting because they put a barricade between people who were friends while they were doing the tasks. They couldn't see each other. And their performance dropped back down to as though they were strangers, which is a strong implication that body language, nonverbal communication, can be super important in achieving these super effective collaborations. And so that's something that's inspiring me a lot moving forward, is this nonverbal part. And moving machine learning forward into rehabilitation is of, pardon me, I've lost myself slightly. It could be machine learning can be incredibly valuable to rehabilitation for the very fact that it can adapt to things. I would really like to see more exploration of machine learning in these human interactions, because it has the potential to take a general solution that's used in rehabilitation, apply that to a patient along with some machine learning, and then the machine learning can customize that general solution, tweak it to be an individualized solution to that patient. And in reinforcement learning, there's this really cool interaction and back and forth between computer science and neuroscience, where a lot of cool stuff comes out of that. And by thinking about some of the stuff I've talked about here today, we might be able to get a similar sort of dialogue going with the joint action literature, with human-human interactions, and then we can share and we can learn and grow both fields together and discover more than we could have if we each just keep working alone in our little silos. So moving just about to the end, much ahead of schedule, there are humans throughout our world, and for the time being, no matter how much we increase the machines, the humans are still going to be there. So the world is filled with human machine learning interactions. And by this I mean interactions where the human and the machines are learning together about each other in order to accomplish their tasks. And a key to this could be in viewing communication as actions in order to help both agents understand each other and create much stronger collaboration between agents of all kinds. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam. I was wondering if you'd given much thought to how you develop trust and deal with uncertainty, because all machine learning has some element of that, and if we're going to have human interactions, we need to address those issues.
Absolutely. That's an important, very important fact in interactions, especially so in human-machine interactions. There's, as much as, especially as computer science and engineering-y sorts, we chagrin anthropomorphizing inanimate objects. We're humans and we're social and we kind of can't help it. And we get upset with anthropomorphized objects when they break what we perceive as our social contract with them, which requires that they have to behave the way we think about them. Probably most of you don't think about using your pencil when you're holding it. But your pencil is not a part of you as much as it may feel 100% natural at this time. But if you're using a mechanical pencil with a weight of lead you're not used to and it's breaking all the time, you start saying, what the heck is wrong with this stupid thing? And then you've paid attention to it. Some of my thoughts on, so the trust is absolutely very important in these sorts of interactions. And I'm interested in anything anyone can share with me about signals we can get from a human that may indicate that to the system that there's some level of trust there, that the human isn't paying attention to it. One of the things we think about with prosthetic arms is how much the human is watching their hand as they're doing a task versus watching where they want the hand to go. And this might indicate that the human is trusting the motion of the arm versus not trusting the motion of the arm, for example. Does that help? Yes.
This is some kind of in the same vein, but I was wondering about what types of, you mentioned body language and being able to, like, if a machine is going to interact with me, let's say I'm just going to read my body language or something along those lines, how would that be set up, let's say, in like a
I think of it a little less in terms of the machine reading the human's body language. So that's that control direction. And a little more in terms of the machine developing a body language to communicate with the human. So in the create example, I said there were lights and sounds. Those were pretty arbitrary. Those are easy things to set up and they can be there. If it's something like a prosthetic arm, you probably don't want lights going off and sounds buzzing all the time when things are going on. You're in a movie theater maybe. You don't want to have to switch your arm off. That's not tremendously embodied. And so the body language I find very interesting, looking at it from the perspective of the machine developing a nonverbal way of communicating with the human. So one way you might think of this is it can't move the servos, but it can add small amounts of resistance, for example. So if I've picked up a glass, and because it's a mechanical arm, I don't feel temperature through it, but it does. And that glass, it turns out, is very hot, but I'm unaware of this. And I'm flinging it to my face to take a big drink of it. The arm can add some resistance to make me go, oh wait, there's something going on here. And I theorize and hope that over time, while that resistance will be embodiment breaking initially, over time the human will understand what that means, and that resistance will just become second nature to, oh, that's hot. The same way as when our hand touches it and we get a feeling of heat in our fingertips.
This is maybe very naive, but I guess sort of like in this world then, what's like the reward of a prosthetic limb? Like, what does it want to do?
Reward isn't necessarily the right term when we start talking about prosthetic limbs. Adam White, in his thesis, coined the term cumulant, which is just making a prediction. What is this signal of interest going to be doing in the future? Reward could still be in place coming from the human. So Vivek or Gautam, I can't remember which, did work on face valuing. So it could get reward for mimicking what the human is doing. It could get reward for, and I'm speaking entirely out of my depth and hypothetically here, we could have an EMG signal that monitors when the human is pleased with what it has done, and when the system registers that it's pleased, that's a reward signal. Do that again. That was the right thing to do in that circumstance.
Right. We had a paper in 2011 where we were using active critical and the human was delivering reward. So there's a myoelectric controller, there's muscle signals, the arm is doing motion, it's a simulated arm, and the person had to like jam on the good bad keys to try to teach the system to do the right thing and the wrong thing.
How does that work?
It didn't work. Whether that's a usable solution for a human is up for grabs. My feeling is no, it's not in the form we had it. And people like Brad Knox have extended that to look at how humans deliver reward to a wide range of reinforcement learning systems, and showed that there's some real problems with the need for humans to continuously and persistently deliver reward.
Right.
So there's a couple of that.
But you would, if you pick up a hot thing and you get burnt, you would want to, in that case, like some sort of instantaneous. I don't know.
There's times when you may wish to provide feedback,
Yeah.
and there's times when you may wish the system just to do its darn job and not require you to keep hammering on the good bad key while you're trying to drink your coffee.
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. It's tricky, but there's a role for reward, but there's a role for other forms of motivation and drive in a system that may not be coupled to what we usually think of as reward. Sorry, Adam. I'm
No problem.
in your mouth,
No
but,
problem.
Yeah,
That was more eloquent than I would have been.
that was back in 2011, so it's a little bit back in this time.
Behind Riley.
So, kind of extension to this, so how much can you use simulations to kind of retrain these agents to like interact with humans? Because I guess like if they have to just interact with humans and get data, then it would need to be really data efficient, or like it would be very hard to train them. So,
Yeah, I think right now the correct answer to that is I'm not quite sure. Humans may have some sort of baseline where if it starts from here, we'll all have some understanding of what's happening and it just needs to tweak it. But it may also be that each human needs a very individualized system in order for it to really feel like one of theirs. That's not to say is we can't start with some sort of model of a command structure, for example, and have that tweak. But as far as the human interaction, I'm not entirely sure what the answer to that is yet, but I hope to get somewhere down that path before the end of my PhD. Right.
Just circling back a bit for clarification, when you're referring to like the prediction as a way for the arm to get motivation, is that referring to like the arm predicting it's going to be used, if the next state that it enters is going to be something, and then if it predicts that correctly, then it knows to keep performing those kind of predictions? So using expectation as the reward?
Not, you're using a lot of the right words, but not quite in the right manner. So the prediction, sorry. I sometimes forget there's a whole room full of people in front of me. So the prediction isn't a reward in itself, but you don't need a reward to make a prediction. I can make a prediction about how many steps it will take for me to get to that wall. And then I'm just predicting the steps. So the steps is the signal that I'm interested in. And in using reinforcement learning techniques, we can transition from reward to a signal of interest and make a prediction about that signal. Does that help?
I think what you're suggesting is that you couple actions to predictions, but not necessarily learning that policy through direct signals of what we consider reward. Is that
right? Yes. Yes.
Driving towards? Okay. So Joseph Mondillo calls this Pavlovian control. He and Adam and Rich work a lot on this particular style of learning, and we've deployed it in robot arms for well, almost a decade now. So.
Can you put it in the context of a robot arm?
So you might. Well, my first experiment had that arm moving back and forth in the box, the X arm, which is a wearable third arm I developed with Patrick's help my first summer here. And with the experiment, we moved it back and forth in the box. There are walls on either side that when the robot pushes into it will increase its load. And the rub is the human was blindfolded. So the human couldn't see what was happening. The human also had headphones on. They couldn't hear the arm make contact with the wall. And we asked the person to navigate back and forth, making gentle contact with each wall as many times as they could without damaging the servos. So we make a prediction about the load that the arm is going to experience in the next certain amount of time. And then we triggered a communication channel, in this case a vibration, to the human when the prediction of that load went above a certain level. So we're predicting the upcoming load. And when that prediction goes high, we indicated to the human that load was impending. Does that help?
Yes, but what was the learning part?
It was learning the upcoming load. Okay. It was learning a prediction about what was going to happen with the load. It just used the load that it was predicting. When the prediction of the load went above a certain level.
But like, was it updating its model?
In that particular experiment, it wasn't while it was doing the task. It learned in real time while the human was practicing with it.
Okay.
But we discovered we need something like off-policy learning, or it forgets the wall is there when it succeeds in avoiding the wall. I can go into more detail with that later.
All right.
And it's also my iCore paper.
Okay.
So I'll have a poster. Yeah.
So this may be unrelated, but how do we reward the human for continuing the training?
That's a very good question.
Because like I feel like a lot of the times it's like if you were able to go through the whole gauntlet of training, then the human would be able to use this like myoelectric prostheses to a better degree. But it's like, what's the point when you have the actuated arm that works fine enough right now? How do we reward it?
Yeah, I haven't given that a lot of active thought. I think because my thought on the matter is that the human has intrinsic reward systems. And if we can show and convince clinicians that the patient trusts, that it's worth investing in learning to use the system and having the system learn to understand you in the longer run, that there will be an intrinsic reward that will motivate the human to continue to use the arm until it reaches that point. I'm trying not to use the community of capital term. I'm sure Patrick is itching for me to say. Which is a whole other paper that's on archive if you wanted to look that up on Google Scholar. Yeah.
So on that note, why is it hard for people to get used to the myoelectric prosthetics? Like, why is there a big jump from the physical actuators to that?
A big part of it seems to be a lack of awareness and understanding of the myoelectric limb. It's this big weight on their arm, and they use EMG muscle, electrical signals coming from the muscles that in our lab we read from the surface to control it, but there's nothing coming back. The most you get back is maybe the balance or the weight changes when it's at different angles or elevations. Whereas with the physical systems, there's whole cables that go all the way across, and they can do this, and they can feel the cable rub and pull. And as the angles change across the device, the feel of moving it changes, so they get some more of an understanding of what's going on in the limb when they take actions on it than they get in a myoelectric system. And that's a big part of what I'm hoping to help with, is to find systems that will communicate to the human to help the human get a better understanding of what's going on in that system and in that limb.
So is it because what they intend to do is not exactly what's happening, and that's why the lack of feedback is?
What they intend to do is what's happening, but they don't feel it happening as they're doing it.
I'm going to disagree with you on that one. I don't think they work well enough for what they intend to do.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Fair enough. If the human has the proper level of expectation and what they intend to do.
Everyone I've ever seen functioning only does what the person wants, like, at most 75% of the time. Not like a good day. Or more. I think a big part of it is they don't work as well as they should.
So,
And also you're saying, absolutely.
so when we take a motion, we have forward and reverse copies of the action, similar to robotics. I don't know how familiar a lot of the room is with classical engineering sorts of robotics. But the forward version is, I move these joints and I see what happens. The inverse is, my end effector goes here, these are the joint positions I need. And when those line up, you have ownership over that action. You feel like it's something that you've done. In the physical system, they get enough information coming back from the system because of the wires, motions, and stuff changing, that they can get both of those copies going to some extent. They have a better idea what's happening in the limb. So it feels more like something that they've done. Whereas in the myoelectric ones, there's nothing coming back from them at all. So it's a lot harder to develop both directions of that action copy. Does that make sense and help?
Yeah.
And hopefully I didn't butcher that too badly.
No, it's definitely, it's very true. I just think there's like a previous limitation that is like EMG control also just doesn't work that well. There's like if you're a little bit sweaty or like
that's fair. Yeah, over time.
Shifts a little bit, then you could be doing like I feel like I'm doing the literally exact same thing, and my hand is not doing what it was even 5 seconds ago.
Which is another place that putting adaptable machine learning in can help, is adapting that control system. I'm being given time signals though, so thank you all very much for your time.
Adam didn't say there's a lot of algorithmic challenges that are baked into this that include things like wrestling with infinite spans of an outcome happening far into the future from when you gave a stimulus, policies with continuous actions and stochasticity. So there are a lot of algorithmic challenges. If you're curious about those, go chat with Adam sometime, because it's not something that's going to take one mind to solve. We're going to have to use some of our bleeding edge algorithms to solve some of these core problems. So I encourage you all to go chat with Adam and figure out where some of the algorithmic links can be made. It's great data. You can write lots of papers on it.
And I'm happy to help come up with ways to try and break algorithms on physical systems and see what happens when the world is squishier than we'd often like it to be.